Hey guys, welcome to week 2 of our James series. Today we're going to be picking up in James chapter 1, verse 13. James says, "Let no one say when he is tempted, 'I am being tempted by God.' For God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. Then when lust is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. In the exercise of his will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, so that we would be a kind of first fruits among his creatures." So now that James has covered the need for joy and endurance in the midst of trials, he turns his attention to actually the issue of temptation in the midst of these trials. And our human nature is to deflect and to blame when we've been caught in sin. This is the first thing that we see in Genesis chapter 3. Adam blames Eve when God says, "What have you done?" And he says, "It's the woman that you gave me that caused me to sin." And when God addresses Eve, she says, "Well, it's the serpent who lied to me that caused me to sin." So we see from the very beginning that this is in our human nature, but James is not having any part of it. He refuses to accept that the tribes, the followers of Christ, are going to deflect and blame God for temptation and for participation in sin. And so he is saying, if we don't accept the reality that the problem is actually inside of our own hearts, then we will never be able to overcome the temptation and overcome the sin. So James commands us, and it is a very strong word that he uses here. He says, do not just I suggest that you don't, but absolutely do not say that it is God who is tempting you or causing you to sin. That is absurd. And here's the reason why. It's because God is supreme. In his nature, God is unable to be tempted by evil, and he himself is unable to tempt us, because I want you to take note of these attributes that God is, we see about God in James, that James gives to us, that God cannot be tempted and he is not a tempter. It's because God is supreme. He is the greatest thing of all. And to be tempted by something like evil would mean that God thinks that there is something greater than him by which he could be tempted. And that would mean that he would be inviting us to believe that there is something greater than God to be tempted by. And God is not a tempter, because that would carry us away from God being central in our lives. Temptation carries us away from God-centered worship to self-centered worship. And when we begin to worship self, we begin to think that what the self wants is to do greater than what God wants us to do. And the origin of this temptation is not from God. It is from within our own sinful selves. And so James is very adamant, do not blame God, who is supreme, who there is nothing above, who cannot be tempted by anything, because he is all-encompassing of everything good. There is nothing that God could want or be tempted by, and he is not going to tempt you to worship anything other than himself. So do not deflect and blame your temptation and your sin onto God. But James also wants us to understand that sin is shiny. Sin is very enticing. My father-in-law used to be a professional angler, and he talks all the time about how serious they would take this art of fishing, and they would buy the most shiny lures, and they would even create these scents, like these smells that would draw fish to the lures so that they could catch the most and they could win the competitions that they would be a part of. And I want you to know that that's the kind of seriousness with which Satan tries to tempt us. He knows the ways that we are enticed, and he knows our weaknesses, and he's going to do every single thing that he can to make sin look as appealing and as enticing as he possibly can. And here's what we read in 1 Peter 5:8. It says, "Be of sober spirit, be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour." He is in search of somebody who's going to take the bait. He is in search of somebody who's going to look at that shiny thing, who's going to look at that and say, hey, a free meal. That sounds awesome. And the thing about that is that when we take it, it is an anticipation of something that is going to turn out really amazing. That's what the picture James gives us here is like. He said it's like the expectation that something great is going to come out of it. Like if you've seen a movie preview, where you watch a movie preview and you think that movie is gonna be killer. I gotta go on opening day. I'm gonna spend all my money on a ticket and on food and all this kind of stuff. And you sit through this movie, and at the end of it, you think that is 2.5 hours of my life I'm never gonna get back. And that is at least $20 of my budget that I am never going to get back. And oftentimes, sin is much like that, where we anticipate it being this incredible thing. And at the end of it, we are so disappointed and we are so let down, and except it's not just $12 or $20 out of our budget and 2.5 hours out of our lives. It is our actual lives that it is affecting. It is our actual soul that it is affecting. And that's the picture James is painting. He's saying it's going to have this tremendous build up, and then it's going to crash and burn, and sin is just going to leave you disappointed. But he's saying, do not be deceived, my fellow believers. It will not produce what it says it will produce, but you have this hope, and that is that God gives perfect gifts. This is what he says in verse 17, every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above. It comes from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation and no shifting shadow. And I love that, because he is showing you the picture, the difference between what sin produces and what God produces in and through us. There's no variation or shifting shadow. And he's saying, God doesn't say that it's going to produce a certain thing in your life and then he actually flips on you and it produces something different. God says what he means, and when God says this is a good thing for you, it will be a good thing for you. He is a man of his word. God is truth, and he is light. There is nothing in him that needs to be hidden. There is nothing in him that needs to be a secret. There's nothing in him that is trying to trick you. So you can trust that when God gives you something, when God leads you somewhere, when God is doing something in your life, that it will produce the good thing, because that's who our God is. So today we can be sure of this. It is something that is consistent, and it is something we can rely on. So we will stop blaming and be empowered to overcome temptation and sin. We will not be deceived by the lure of sin, but we will pursue the good gifts that God gives, because we know that God is a man of his word.